And to moderate this roundtable, we have the pleasure to have the independent analyst and venture partner remotely from the office. He's sitting right now at the office of Natixis, New York. Ben Evans. Hello, Ben.
Hello.
How are you today?
Not too bad, thanks. Wishing I was in Paris.
Well, next time for sure. With you, you have Lou Kerner, partner blockchain co-inventors. How are you, Lou?
Great to be here. I wish I was in Paris too.
All right, you know what, Tim? If you say you wish to be to Paris too, we're going to organize something, like a group. How you doing, Tim? Welcome. You are head of EMEA Galaxy Digital. How are you?
That's right. I'm very well. Thank you very much. I wish I was on the moon.
That's a good one. Sky is the limit. I understand that. And please welcome here in France at Roland Garros. We have the pleasure to welcome Luc Jaudet, excuse me, on your warm applause. Hello, Luc. Welcome. Luc, your partner, ex-Eng, and co-founder Ariane. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have the good notes. And Thibaut Morin. Hello, Thibaut. Managing partner of Level Up. Am I correct? Normally you touch nothing.
Probably, yeah, you are correct.
Good. Thank you. Welcome. Ben, I think the quorum has been reached, like we said. So now the floor is yours for 45 minutes, and then we move on to Q&A sessions. And don't worry for the Q&A session. We have Bruno and Pierre.
Great. So thank you very much for that. And it's really, this is a very 2022 kind of format of hybrid New York, Paris, big screen, small screen, microphone. So we'll see what we can do with that. I think it's kind of an interesting kind of place to start is we have had several sort of crypto winters. And I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that we went into another crypto winter, at least in some places, in the summer. But meanwhile, we've got this sort of huge undercurrent of really interesting creative energy. As I think about my career in tech, which is only kind of 20 years, so obviously there's people in the room who go back longer than that, but I can't remember something where we've had this many sort of waves of enthusiasm, waves of kind of controversy and noise and kind of negativity and nonsense, but also sort of huge amount of kind of creative energy and fertility and kind of creation. Of people building kind of interesting stuff. And it's also kind of interesting to think about how many different kinds of conversations one can have, because there's a conversation around distributed finance. There's conversations around sort of NFTs as they relate to things like the creative industries and music and art and maybe games. There's conversations around blockchain as it relates to so-called Web3 and sort of building competitors to Facebook and Google. So in a sense, when we sort of talk about digital assets, there's a lot of different things we can talk about. There's a lot of different one-hour conversations you could have. You could have a whole conversation about what does this mean for art, and a whole conversation about what does this mean for settlement processes on stock exchanges, which is kind of an interesting spread. But kind of bearing in mind the audience here, I think it's kind of interesting to kind of ask the panel, when we set aside all of the explosion of noise in the last kind of 6, 12, 18 months, where have we got to on building kind of real services that get deployed inside businesses? So if we sort of maybe start in this room and then kind of go around, is this like a 10-year away thing, or is it like a 6 months ago thing? Where do we think we live on that spectrum?
Sure. Well, kind of like I think using the analogy of the internet's a great analogy. And one of the things. Do you know when the first email was sent?
Mid-70s, early 70s.
If you ask most boomers, or I'm sorry, I'm a boomer, but if you ask kids in their 20s, most of them are going to say mid-80s. And in fact, the first email was sent in 1968, and it was LO because they were saying log on, but the system crashed after LO. So I think stuff takes a long time, and I got to assume in all of those years there were waves when the few people who were doing it thought that it was closer and then further and got more excited. And so I think we're at the very beginning of what I think is going to be the biggest thing to happen in the history of humanity with crypto and these new technologies and the metaverse. And I think what we've seen is DeFi from something that's decentralized and scaled. We're scaling DeFi. So what we've already seen.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
I think we're connected. Sorry, we disconnected quickly. Do you want to go to the Paris?
Yep.
It's our turn. All right, great.
Sure.
I'll follow on what Lou just said. Where we are at right now is probably we've had Bitcoin, which introduced blockchain, was kind of initiated in 2008. We've had 14 years right now of infrastructure buildup. And we've built some really interesting infrastructure, and we're really in that infrastructure phase. What we've seen in the last 18 months, especially with NFTs, but of course with DeFi a little bit, but I think the NFT kind of wave that we have over the last 18 months have really started showing a much more massive adoption, something much closer to services that could be for a large audience. We're still quite early, and our bet, at least at EXPLORETECH, is that we're getting out of this infrastructure phase and in starting to get into the kind of service, like mass market stage with crypto. But yes, indeed, to date, even I co-founded a company called Ariani that does NFTs for luxury brands before switching to investment. And Ariani today, after 5 years, it's about 1 million NFTs with about 600,000 customers. So it's large, but for the market we're looking at, it's still somewhat small. So we have those early experiments that are of a mass service that's starting to be adopted. And I think, once again, NFTs is where we're seeing it, the most interesting early adoption for a mass market, even more than DeFi. But we're still quite early because, once again, we had to build up that infrastructure over the last 14 years.
Shall I continue? So I totally agree. We are at the infancy of an ecosystem. I think NFT is a very good use case. It helps mass market understand what could be the usage of Web3 in the future, sometimes with some excess, but sometimes there are good lessons to take. And I really think that what we've seen last year, if we forget about the hype and the hate, let's say right now, we see some use case. And you mentioned that DeFi is now almost mass market, at least on the younger generation. The number of people who are using DeFi and cryptocurrency is huge. I think NFT shows us that we can find some IP assets, some digital assets who have a value like a currency. And it's not there yet, but the infrastructure are being built and will be built. And I think this is really, this period has shown us where it will go in the future. We have seen in many industries some IP assets becoming financial products. I think when you draw the line with NFT, IP product, and DeFi, it's easy to see where it's going, in my view.
Great, this is kind of interesting. I mean, I think as it's kind of interesting to think about the early internet, not in the sense of like, well, the internet didn't work and then it worked, therefore anything else that looks terrible will work too, which is a kind of a very basic fallacy that some people fall into. But just in the sense of, I remember using the internet, trying to use the internet in the early 90s, and it was very difficult to do anything. You had to know a huge amount, you had to understand a huge amount, and really all you could do was to say to other people, hey, look, I'm using the internet. I mean, you knew one person who had an email address, and you'd send them an email, and then you'd phone them up, and they'd say, did you get my email? And they would say, hold on. And then they'd call you back an hour later and said, yeah, I got your email. This is amazing. There was no Amazon, but there was also no web. And you know, it's kind of interesting.
And it was amazing.
It was amazing. It was amazing all in the potential, but you couldn't actually do anything.
Yes.
You could just say, imagine what you could do with this, what you could be, what you could build with this. And it's sort of interesting just listening to you talk. You know, we had a sort of a web browser. We had the web, which was suddenly this model for how you could actually tie this together into a product. And then the Netscape moment kind of a couple of years later, in the sort of the early 90s. It's also, as I spent sort of early part of my career as a telecoms analyst, interesting to think about the iPhone and to think about how we felt before the iPhone, because before the iPhone, no one was sitting thinking we need a breakthrough. It felt like it was working. And then suddenly, you know, the sort of meteorite came through and kind of blew the top off the market. And there's very often that moment where there's this kind of one thing that suddenly kind of pulls everything together. And everything was all there and sort of latent. So with the internet, you had the you had the protocols, you had TCP/IP, and then suddenly somebody kind of worked out almost by accident, though this is the right way to do it.
I don't think Andreessen, it was an accident, right?
So Tim Berners-Lee, you know, no one quite knew. Mark knew this was going to be a big deal. And, you know, he grabbed onto it with both hands and rode it to Silicon Valley. The funny thing is, he will now say that when he arrived in Silicon Valley, he thought it was over and he'd missed the whole thing because he kind of arrived in this winter after the kind of PC industry had crashed.
My favorite all-time crypto tweet is from 2011. Some guy tweeted, "I can't believe I sold all my Bitcoin at 6 cents. It's 80 cents now."
Yeah, exactly. So, but there's that sort of sense of like the latent possibility, and it's not happening, and people are kind of building bits and pieces, and then suddenly something comes together and it all kind of works. And we sort of had that in a little bit of a way with NFTs. I think, you know, obviously there's, you know, NFTs are sort of a microcosm of crypto in that, like, there's an NFT winter. But then that will come back and get expressed in different ways. But one of the things, I mean, I'm editorializing rather than just moderating, but one of the kind of questions I want to ask is, like, as we think about the internet, and indeed as we think about open source, what happened was the complexity got abstracted away. There was a use case, but there was also it got abstracted away, and the user didn't have to know how this worked. And so as we think particularly about kind of consumer applications for this, how much do we think the user has to know how this works? And how much do you think this gets abstracted away so that it's just kind of a bank account that works differently, or it's a website that works differently, but you don't really have to know?
Again, my assumption is it all gets abstracted away, right? The number of people who actually want to learn about crypto rounds to zero, right? I mean, it takes a long time. You know, you got to go down the rabbit hole, and it's an awesome experience. And the reason why today it's so fun to be in the industry is because the people in the industry are the smartest people in the world, because they're the only people who took the time, you know, to learn about it. You know, it's the curious people. But, you know, until you can, like, pick up, you know, the crypto and use it like the cell phone, just not take a lesson and get massive value. That's when we'll go mass media. And you know, I've met countless projects that say, you know, we're the thing that's going to bring crypto to the mass market. And there are so many brilliant people working on things. And, you know, as was said, there's now been all this infrastructure that's been built. Similar to, I was the largest streamer of video in 2000, but it was a terrible experience. Because the pipes weren't fat enough, and then go to 2005, and the pipes were finally fat enough, and somebody uploaded a video called Lazy Sunday onto YouTube, and became the fastest growing website in the history of the internet up to that date. And then, you know, video on the internet was a thing. And I think, you know, I don't know whether we're 1 day or a week or 5 years away from kind of the Lazy Sunday moment coming to crypto, but I'm pretty sure it's coming.
What do we think in Paris? Paris and the moon. I think we missed the moon last time.
Hey, so I think to your question, there's two ways of seeing it. I think the first one is when you talk really about users. One type of users are the end users, like everybody in this room, and of course like my parents, for who it took 15 years to finally get a smartphone. So people that are definitely you know, not tech savvy. And here, the only thing that they really need to understand is honestly the underlying technology. It's what blockchain really brings, which is this new concept of true digital ownership. It's the fact that you can truly own a digital object. And that actually comes in a lot of different ways, but it's more of a feeling than really an understanding. It's like, you know, it's always that question, what is an NFT? And if people say, oh, it's just a JPEG, they haven't understood what an NFT really is. So that's a first way of seeing it. The other way of seeing it is with developers. And it's what this technology brings to developers is a platform where you can actually build and be sure that you'll always be able to call on all those protocols and services without ever having the rules changed on you. I mean, that's where you have those stories about, you know, how to replace Facebook as a platform. The reason why developers are going to move to those new platforms is because they've been burnt before by platforms, meaning they've built something cool. It's the Zynga example. Zynga builds this great company around the Facebook algorithm, and then making those little games like Farmville, and then one day to the other, Facebook changes the algorithm. They lose 50% of their revenue. That's where they'll be. That's why, you know, your question, there's always two answers for me here. One is the final user and what they really need to understand. And definitely they don't need to understand, and they will need to have a lot of interfaces and make it easy to use this complex technology, but the same way we have for the web. And on the other hand, you have developers. And here, they are interested in technology because, once again, what it enables is freedom from those kind of platforms that become really power hungry once they reach a certain scale.
Yeah, I agree that the platform on the one hand have a lot of power, and it's very nice to feel free from them. But if you take some economies like mobile gaming, without a platform, it will not exist. So between decentralization and platform, you have to find the appropriate way to reach your market. So I believe we will see probably a mix of an open platform on Web3, but not fully DAO, totally decentralized. I believe you need some centralization. And the reason why I believe that is because if you have no centralization or no product for the mass market adoption, the mass market adoption always comes from one usage. If you take Facebook, that was nice to see the picture, Instagram, Snapchat, it's a use case, or YouTube you mentioned, it's a use case people understand immediately. They use it, it becomes viral, it's a use case, and then it becomes a platform. And so someone will develop a usage like this, so people may or may not understand what is behind, but for me, for the mass market, is really finding what will be the killer use case that will make it just adopted by everyone. It could be, you mentioned the Twitter or Facebook based on Web3. It could be your ID certificate while keeping your secrecy in a way. So you're certified, we know that it's you who speaks. This is what you are doing for the brands in a way. We know that the brand is issuing the certificate on NFT. So there's a trusted partner. So the benefit of a Twitter, you can be both responsible and anonymous at the same time. That could be one example, but I'm not saying this is the one that will work.
Ben, the view from the moon?
View from the moon, please, yes, if you're still there.
Yes, I'm very much still on the moon. You know, you know what's refreshing about this conversation, having been in so many of these types of panels over the last few years, is we're not really talking about blockchain or, you know, private versus public or any of the sort of more technical elements of the substrate that's being built. We're actually talking about value. We're talking about commerce. We're talking about the next generation of companies that deliver value to consumers and institutions and governments. And that's, I feel that's it's a turning point when that starts to be the conversation rather than the more technical element. And as much as I do think there's huge value in looking at the internet, the evolution of the internet, and certain key moments in that evolution, there's actually a really nice analogy which I've found to be quite powerful in helping people understand the gravity of what we're about to go through, which is what Lou was saying about earlier. This is really pretty seismic, what we're about to live through. And what I call it the Casablanca principle. Could be any movie, but I've just gone with Casablanca because I think it's memorable. So Casablanca was filmed in 1947, and of course the medium that was used in Casablanca back then was celluloid. And then with time, we went from celluloid to Super 8 to video cassettes and Betamax to laser discs to DVD, and we got to Blu-ray in the end. And at that point, you know, we can all remember, you still buy Blu-rays, like there's a certain feeling that that's digital. There's a certain feeling that that's a digital medium. It's got this high quality product on it. But we only have really experienced what a truly digital medium can look like because of the advent of streaming and that whole kind of new digitally native ecosystem. I can now film Casablanca 2022 with a digital camera, and it doesn't hit anything physical all the way from the moment that it hits the lens and the camera through to the editing, the distribution, and ultimately the viewing medium that we all now know as our TVs, our phones, and our iPads, et cetera, et cetera. And the seismic shift that has led to within the media industry is plain for us all to see. This is a real thing that's playing out as we speak, and to some extent has some way to play out. Now, what we're about to go through in a broader sense in multiple industries, and you know, I happen to be very focused on the financial services industry, so that's where it was most interesting, is the same thing. The financial services industry is arguably at best still at Blu-ray stage. Some of it is still actually even further back. I mean, some still use fax machines, believe it or not, for certain elements of how they communicate. So when it goes truly digitally native, it really is going to change dramatically the landscape of how we interact from a financial services perspective. That's a $700 trillion kind of asset class, just if you look at the derivatives industry alone. This is incredibly meaningful. But now back to the question, back to sort of bring it to reality, back to your question about, well, where are we in the evolution? Well, it depends. I think there are definitively examples of where this is happening for real. There are profitable businesses in gaming that are leveraging elements of this technology right now today, and we have a fund that is prominently investing in that, and there's a lot of value being created today. NFTs, we sold a company called Artifact to Nike, and they are now, as far as I last saw, the biggest consumer brand in terms of selling NFTs. 180 million of NFT sales from Nike, selling digital twins of their sneakers. Now that's arguably quite a small number, 180 million, but it's a meaningful statement that Nike, one of the biggest consumer brands in the world, has embraced this, and so have their customers. But then you look at financial services and you look at digital securities, and it's painfully slow. We're not getting to where we want to go yet. And so it depends where you are in the economy, how far we've gotten to, but the proof points of where it can be impactful are there. And the last point I'll make is back to your Anderson Horowitz point. When they raise $5 billion in a heartbeat to invest in this space without really flinching at all, and in fact it's oversubscribed, it probably tells you that the smart guys in the room who called the last sort of revolution are seeing this revolution coming too. So there's an inevitability to this, but when we start to see that Netscape moment is anyone's guess.
So kind of taking this to kind of another, again, a layer of abstraction, which is a word we seem to be using a lot, but sort of making this sort of tangible and thinking about particularly financial services, given kind of the audience. As we think about what blockchain, crypto, DeFi, pick your terminology, pick your definition, does, one of the ways you could think about this is, on the one hand, there is an ability to tokenize or securitize things that you couldn't have tokenized or securitized before, or do that in a different way, or add software to that or add contracts to that. Another side is ways that you can run a market in a different way, either for those securities or those tokens or whatever you want to call them. I'm not a securities lawyer, and I'm giving no advice on whether or not a token is a security or not. I should just say that very clearly, before the wall before somebody breaks down the door and says, aha, this is a security. But my point is that there is tokenization of things, and there's making things into securities or making them tradable, which is a very, very broad spectrum from putting the deed to a house on a blockchain all the way through to saying whatever you post on a social network is a token. And so is that a security? Is it not a security? But then there's another side to this, which is the market. And the fact that you're putting things into a market that might work in a very different way, that might have different liquidity, different rules, different sort of settlements, different contracts, different ways that that could actually work. And I'm just kind of interested in kind of the two sides to that. That on the one hand, you can kind of create different kinds of asset, bring assets that can allow new kinds of assets to be traded or securitized or tokenized. On the other hand, the market itself could work differently. Or could work in different ways or do different things or not be going through some gatekeeper. I'm just kind of curious what the panel thinks about those kind of two sides to building a market. So on the one hand, you're trading something that you couldn't trade before, but on the other hand, the trading is working differently.
You want to start off and...
So the fact that you can actually create assets out of brand new products is interesting. I have to admit it's to a certain extent also the kind of the issue of that we've had in blockchain is that everything is always talking about a new market, so the new product or a new asset actually. And we're not talking about products usually. We talk about assets that can be traded, and while I think that it's useful, I don't think everything we do in life and everything we purchase is actually here to be traded. A lot of things are just bought on primary markets and never sold in a secondary market, and the important thing here is also to make people want to buy new types of products that bring them new kind of experiences. So yes, of course, I'm interested in how we can create new types of assets. It is of interest. But when you talk about making this technology something that is much more mass market, I think you need to start creating products that are like Artifact did, sneakers that people purchase because they actually want to have those digital sneakers, because they find them cool, because they can collect them, share them with friends. And of course, there's also the possibility you might sell them one day, but we all know that most of the sneakerheads don't sell their sneakers, and that the value that you put on some sneakers or on watches or other collectibles is not really a real market. It's extremely illiquid. But people are happy to own those collectibles for different reasons, for the community, for the experience it gives you. So I have to admit that's the topic I'm much more interested in, and the topic that I think we need to move towards much more. Now, this being said, yes, indeed, of course, this is what blockchain has shown over the last several years and almost over the last decade. With the advent of DeFi, we've shown some much sturdier market structures. We've had crashes in the crypto markets where centralized exchanges had to go offline for a while to wait the market out, and where we had decentralized protocol proceed to all the liquidations automatically and never be at risk. So there are definitely, the DeFi is a better market structure, and it has shown to be. On the other hand, when you talk about tokenizing new assets, that's a big topic right now for DeFi, because it is still heavily, it's mainly cryptocurrencies that are the assets traded on those markets, and there is a need to diversify and bring kind of like real world assets. So there are great companies, tokenizing real estate to facilitate access to real estate, but also to make it kind of a more liquid asset that you can borrow against. Plenty of those opportunities are interesting, of course, and we're always happy to see more of those.
Yeah, I think that tokenization of assets is a trend that has always existed. In the history, before the financial market, no one had equity in a company except very few people. Then the market democratized the access to equity, and not in France, but in the rest of the world. But it started from there. And we saw some new asset class on regulated market coming from time to time. 5 years ago, the Mercuriadis convinced the market that music rights were a tradable asset that can reach millions of small investors, while it was concentrated within major before and some private equity, and then it opened the market. So we can have a lot of creativity on finding assets that can be tokenized, or I would say more democratized and or accessible to some people. But in a non-regulated market, whether it's DeFi or centralized is not the question to me. It's the creativity of people. There will be some class of assets that will be beneficial and nice investment. I mean, it's nice to be able to buy a piece of Song of Bowie. It will have value in a long time, for sure. Buying real estate, it depends where, how, what happens with the rules. The same thing, if you do it with some friends buying a building, it can go very bad. And so with no regulation, and this is, I think, one of the interesting things with DeFi, people say, I feel responsible, I have to do my due diligence, and I can earn a lot, but I accept to lose a lot because I've not done my job. I don't know how mass market this statement is, to be honest, but this is the most surprising thing to me today. So I think we will see new classes of assets, some very interesting, and in the middle there will be some scams or some failures because we know in the market equity story is a lot.
Well, why don't I jump in here? I think there's been so much discussion about tokenization over the last couple of years, especially. And if I modify my principle from Casablanca to Miles Davis, who was also recording in 1947, like there's another step that we're all about to go through in this journey. The asset, the recording by Miles Davis, whether he did it then or if he was alive and did it today, would be the same asset. It's a recording of someone making music. The way in which it's been distributed, listened to, has changed dramatically over time. And there's another step we're about to go through, which is music NFTs. It's been referred to here in terms of ownership. It becomes a different kind of way of packaging the very same asset, though. And it might confer different rights to different people in different ways and have different distribution mechanisms, but the asset hasn't changed. Now extend that to capital markets, equity, debt, everything that currently kind of exists will eventually end up in this new substrate, and it will be the same asset class traded differently, distributed differently, with perhaps different ownership rights and ways of slicing and dicing it. But it is the same asset, be it tokenized or not. What's interesting is when you get into the new types of asset, which it's less obvious, I think, to all of us what they're going to be. The more material change in the short run is going to be the fact that we're going to be taking this entire, hundreds of trillions of assets and putting them on this new substrate. Now, then we talk about liquidity. Liquidity is probably one of the most, I think, misunderstood phenomenon even in capital markets, right? It's just the formation of liquidity, and what it means to have liquidity is a very complex idea. I think in consumer world, it's a bit different. In a regulated world, it becomes an entirely different prospect. Who has access? How do you control those markets? And really, what is this new substrate doing? This new substrate is giving us abilities to kind of modify that in different ways. I would like to think that we'll have new ways of forming liquidity. I'm somewhat skeptical. The DeFi element is definitely helpful in some respects, but it has major limitations in others. What's exciting is to see, hopefully, that people get carried away with, I create an asset and suddenly it's liquid in DeFi. That's just not how this is going to work. It's impossible to create liquidity out of thin air by just changing the substrate. Other things have to change. But there is no question that the signposts are there, that we're going to end up with better marketplaces where the liquidity is necessary, and sometimes it's not, which is the point that's already been made.
Yeah, there's a story. There's a famous British DJ who was kind of a champion of new and experimental music called John Peel, and there's a story that he was talking to a friend in the record industry, and he said, "I can't understand why this record isn't a hit. Everyone I know bought a copy," and his friend said, "No, you know everybody who bought a copy. It's the other way around. And that is a story about music rights, also a story about liquidity. There are many stock market jokes about liquidity, I think, most of which arrive when you decide you want to sell instead of when you want to buy, and you discover, no, the reason the price was going up was because you were buying it. That's not quite what liquidity means. I mean, there's another question here, I think, which is, and we've kind of talked about lots of layers of abstraction and centralization, decentralization. One of the questions here, which applies from both when people talk about trying to replace consumer internet services, but also when we talk about finance, is the question of this word gatekeeper or intermediary. Like, who is it that provides the services on top? Who is it that looks after this? Where is it there's a consumer or as a buyer or a seller? Where do you go? If I want to buy an NFT, somehow it seems I have to go to a Web2 service. If I want to, the internet was, you know, we forget now, but the essence of the internet was that it was radically decentralized. There's this wonderful story from the early 90s that I think Steve Jobs said to Craig McCaw, or possibly the other way round. Have you seen this internet thing? It's great, we should buy it. Which today sounds absurd, but at the time that was kind of how it worked. But of course, then you get Google, and you get Amazon, and you get Facebook, and you get intermediary centralizing layers on top. And, you know, as we think about particularly a sort of a financial services audience, like, how much does this remove those intermediaries, those gatekeepers, those service providers? How much does this just create new problems and opportunities for them to help their customers with?
Well, you know, I think, you know, the big thing that's going on right now is the metaverse, right? And crypto is an enabling technology of the metaverse. And then you obviously have to define what the metaverse is. For me, you know, I call this reality. And once you're on this, then you're in mixed reality, but I think you're in the metaverse. And then when you know, and it's you know, it's a spectrum, and then at the end you have an Oculus Rift on, and then you're in virtual reality. And I'm pretty sure every day for the rest of my life that, you know, humanity as a whole is going to be spending a higher percent of its time in the metaverse as defined, getting closer to the, you know, the Oculus Rift thing. And now I forgot the question because that was the setup to answering the question, which was
well, this is the sign of old age, obviously. But,
or drugs.
Yeah, or too much crypto. No, the question is, we have all of this decentralization, and we had the last wave.
Well, yeah, the gatekeeper.
The last wave of decentralization got
so
gatekeepers.
The gatekeepers, look, right. The only thing I know for sure is whatever it turns out to be is different than what anybody thinks it's going to turn out to be. But where I think we are at the moment is I believe, you know, and I use the term fucking war for the soul of the metaverse between what I call FAMGA, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and the community. And it feels epically like Star Wars, and they're the Death Star, and we're the Alliance. And, you know, I think most of the time the Death Star wins, and I think the world is a much worse place if the Death Star wins. You know, it's great for them and their shareholders, and but, you know, for the rest of us, you know, if the community were able to control it and set the rules, and we've seen some things where the community does. I don't know if you've heard of Brain Trust. It's a decentralized, you know, effectively, you know, service where engineers work on, you know, large-scale software projects, and it's scaling and it's decentralized, and it's great for everybody in the world. You know, every industry could be run like that, but my guess is it'll continue to be controlled by FAMGA.
You get pass?
I agree. I think trading, because it's a lot about trading Web3. Trading is built on trust, and so to have the trust, you can believe in a decentralized organization, but you have to ask yourself, what is the governance of this decentralized organization? Is it a real democracy, or is it an autocracy? You have some actors of the Web3, I think of the Binance, for instance, who are pouring a lot of money in the system, and their goal is obviously to find the cornerstone to be the centralizator or one or the other functions. And so I think the conjunction of this is that we will end up with some kind of centralization, probably in a more open way, i.e. we may have a series of infrastructure with trusted partners to which some innovators will plug new services, but there will be some functions where you will need probably trust, and it will not be black or white, but I don't see how we can avoid a kind of centralization to build the trust of the masses.
So we go back to this debate of decentralization and centralization. I don't think it's either one or the other. It is, once again, the core interesting thing in blockchain is this idea of true digital ownership. It's the fact that I can really own products or assets that are digital, something that I could not do before because there was no technology to do that. I always had a centralizing party that was the one that ensured that I really owned an asset. Once you have this, the question is, where can you port it? And you can go into a, if we take the loose example of metaverses, we can go into more decentralized metaverses like Decentraland, where it's slightly more distributed in its ownership, or you can go into a metaverse like Meta if they enable you to bring your assets. What's important is that you still truly own your assets, and you can go from one of those worlds to another, one of those centralized worlds to another, but you can port those assets from one to the other. And to me, that's the only thing that's important. So we will always have coexistence of decentralized assets or decentralized solutions and centralized solutions. There are great things about centralization, efficiency. There will always be some things that are really interesting about centralization. However, decentralization brings you this bright new thing, which is I can truly own a digital product, and that's the most important.
Well, look, I'm a card-carrying, zealot for all things digital assets and everything that it can do for us. But I think you can look back to Bitcoin, which is without a doubt one of the greatest sort of experiments, which has become a reality and will be here for a long, long time, that we've ever seen. If you go back into Bitcoin, it itself has demonstrated the limitations of DeFi. Right? At some point, there had to be centralized institutions in place to support Bitcoin. Just stick with Bitcoin. Don't even go beyond that. And that's because there are certain realities when you reach certain scales, certain levels of scale, and there are certain actors that get involved. And so, yes, I agree with the general commentary. Trust can be created in the extraordinary, powerful way that it's done through the Bitcoin network and other DLTs and blockchains. But also, eventually, it has to come from regulation and law and from that sort of comfort level. That's where trust can also come from. And so centralization is inevitable, certain levels of it. But I think it's fair to say, I would also argue that minimum viable centralization is the right way to go. Like, you don't want more of it, because that inevitably leads to fattened intermediaries, and fattened intermediaries just takes value out of the system for the ultimate consumer. And philosophically, everyone has to get comfortable with that balance, and where it eventually lands, we don't really know. One thing that I find really encouraging is that the legislative dialogue in multiple jurisdictions has evolved. As an example, in the UK, to the point that the Law Commission has recognized that there's a new type of asset that the current legal framework doesn't cover, which is an intangible digital asset. That's fantastic that they've recognized that, because it's going to allow the same safeguards to be applied that are currently applied by English law, which is the dominant law framework around the whole world. And that's going to allow us to build more. That's going to give us certainty and actually use these tools. Until we've gotten that globally, we'll still be a bit stuck. And those fattened intermediaries, unfortunately, will keep getting fatter. But we want to get rid of that.
I'll disagree with that. I think that this is a thing in decentralization. The reason that I'm here is because ultimately it doesn't matter what the regulators do. That this is happening, and what we're seeing already is really significant regulatory arbitrage, where countries like Portugal that are opening their arms and providing accommodating regulatory environments are seeing an influx of talented people and an influx of capital. And countries like the United States that are saying, hey, you know, you do anything in crypto, we're going to throw you in jail. Maybe.
Everything is a security, which is actually a really interesting problem. I mean, I spend a lot of my time talking to regulators, partly in crypto, but actually in sort of other fields like kind of antitrust and competition and privacy and so on. And there's a lot of sort of intellectual puzzles for regulators in technology in that it doesn't sort of fit traditional models of looking at industries. You know,
well, it depends what they're solving for. You know,
well, this is kind of the challenge is that you can look at a token as sitting on a spectrum, and at one end it's absolutely a security, and on the other end, no, it's just an entry in a database.
Security or not, what are they solving for?
But this is exactly the point, and so therefore that model doesn't work. And so you have to ask, well, what problem is it that you're actually trying to solve here? Are you trying to stop Ponzi schemes? Are you trying to stop insider trading? Are you trying to stop small investors being robbed? Those are kind of tangible policy objectives. And arguing
that's not what they're
But arguing is it a security might be the wrong argument.
You know, I was on CNBC the day after Terra Luna collapsed, and they asked me point blank. They go, "Was this a Ponzi scheme?" And I said, absolutely not. It wasn't a Ponzi scheme. It was a Ponzi strategy. A scheme is when they lie to you about what they're doing. If you looked at the code, they said, we're going to take your money, you know, the new people's money, and give it to the old people. And that's what the code did. And should people be allowed to invest in that? You know, that's personally, I think people should be allowed to invest in it. The government says, hey, we're here to protect investors, so you can't invest in private companies, right, if you're too poor. But, you know, so why don't you go down, you know, you can't invest in Facebook when it's private, but go down the street and buy a lottery ticket. So yeah, I'm not sure what they're solving for.
Go buy a penny stock. I mean, again, to the point of other industries, I mean, it's sort of, I think it's always interesting in these conversations to look at Uber. Because you can say,
exactly. Yes.
What is it that you're trying to solve for? Problem one, you want an agreed price. You want to be sure that the driver isn't a criminal. You want to be sure the vehicle doesn't fall apart. And in the past, you had two ways of doing that. Either you had a car with a mechanical meter that was painted a certain color, or you phoned for somebody to come and get you. And Uber gives you a third way of doing that. But your objectives haven't changed at all. You still have an agreed price. You still make sure the vehicle's inspected. You still make sure that the driver isn't a criminal. It's just now you kind of have to adjust your regulation to reflect the fact that
right. But your Uber became Uber without caring about regulations, right? They just did it. They didn't ask anybody for permission to do it. They just did it. They asked for forgiveness.
But at the same time, they weren't breaking the fundamental assumption, which is how does the pricing work? How does the safety work? There was just a different way of thinking about those underlying policy objectives. Equally, when you say is an Uber driver an employee or not, that's not really a tech regulation question at all. That's an employment law kind of problem. Which is a whole other sort of set of kind of regulatory question. Is this a securities problem? Is this a consumer protection problem? Is this is it an employment law question? What kind of regulatory problem are we trying to solve here? I think we're actually almost out of time, as I believe, because I think we were asked to wrap up on the hour. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely, Ben. Okay, it's perfect timing, actually. Thank you very much. I mean, so engaging.
That was a great conversation.
Yeah, and now it's time for the Q&A session. So please, if you have any questions. Here we go. I'll get back to you, Bruno. Don't worry.
Hi, everybody. Fred Dalibard, involved in blockchain for Group BPC. One question that interests us as a bank is, when do you think corporate treasuries will be using DeFi for their refinancing?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, there are some experiments already. Centrifuge in Switzerland does some tokenization of commercial debt. That's about $80 million worth of, so small amounts. But I mean, it's starting to kind of happen. On a slightly different topic, Société Générale Laforge took a $20 million loan on MakerDAO. So it's things that are starting to happen. Like everything, the question is, I mean, it's like asking me end of the 1990s, when is everybody going to put their credit card on, accept to put their credit card online? I'm old enough to remember that at the end of the 90s, most people used to say, I'll never buy anything online because I can't trust the security, I can't use my credit card online. now everybody does it. It's not even a question anymore. And I think it's going to be the same difficulty here with corporate debt. It's like, when is it going to become accepted? When is the risk level going to be considered, safe enough to do it?
I think I have an additional point on that. I think it will come when some companies will get revenues in crypto and will do spendings in cryptos. Because all the gaming companies today, they are all manage their treasury with cryptos because they get revenues in cryptos and spend some money in cryptos for developers. So I think to me, it's as simple as that, because today with the volatility we see, some company can try, but why not taking a very volatile currency? It makes not a lot of sense today, if you don't have a use. But if you have a use, it's obvious that you...
Well, in a lot of cases, when you're a company that has crypto revenues, the reason why you keep it in crypto is because it is somewhat difficult to bring it back into fiat because well, in different countries, it really depends. But in France, for instance, most companies who make revenues in crypto, they prefer to keep it there and not raise a suspicion of their bank and bring it back on.
In my example, it's really because they pay their developers in crypto, so they know they need it for the next month and the month after. So,
all right. And
well, I think Fred's questions on sure. Using DeFi, which is sort of sufficiently broad to say, does that mean that we're bringing crypto assets onto the treasury balance sheet, or does that mean that we're using DeFi rails to raise, cash and money market instruments, short-term money, corporate debt onto the balance sheet? And I think the latter, that can happen, and we've seen some examples cited. There are others that aren't public where there are very significant global banks who are thinking about doing this. The challenge isn't so much that was the ability there to do it. It's the buy side. It's who's going to actually take it on. In some respects, who's holding all of this debt? It's the buy side. It's the large money market funds around the world. That is, and they are really holding it on behalf of a lot of consumers. They need to get their head around this. So I think the challenge is to the buy side to know that they can actually take this, to know how to custody it, etc. And those things are being built out. That's exciting because it's only a matter of time, because the state of the art exists to actually enable that right now.
All right, thank you very much. Another question, maybe? Bruno, Pierre, of course. Allez, Bruno. And thank you, Fred, by the way.
Bruno, Natixis. One question regarding central banks. Why are they still so reluctant to adopt cryptocurrencies as reserve currencies, despite all the good things you were talking about?
Ça c'est fait.
Who wants to take the political question? It's a complicated question. I mean, the CBDCs are a big topic at so decentralized currency, cryptocurrencies that are controlled by the central bank is actually a topic that is getting quite a bit of interest at the central bank level. Now there's also a question just of control. It's like if you're a central bank, you have control over the euro. If you start having a decentralized currency, you're losing that control. Do you really want to lose that control? But to me, it's more of a political question. It's like, how do we actually build our societies and our political system rather than really a technological question?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll add. From a central bank standpoint and central bank digital currencies, China's, last I heard, they have 400 million people using their digital yuan, and they're going to start distributing it around the world. And their belts and tunnels, what's it called, belts and bridges?
Belt and bridge and road. Bridge and road.
Yeah, something. All of that. They say they're going to move all that to their digital currency. And I think a lot of the world is going to be introduced to crypto through the digital yuan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a point. What we were saying in the last question is, what's your policy objective here? So, what is it that a central bank wants to do? How does it think about it running the currency? What are the objectives it has in doing that? if you can integrate those into a central bank digital currency, great. But the last thing you want to do is adopt a technology that makes your policy objectives impossible.
Well, but now
you need to make sure those are aligned.
Right now, I think China's going to emerge, rapidly as kind of the second kind of global currency, right? They're creating a whole nother rails to compete with SWIFT, and I'm pretty sure every country in the world is excited about that, right? Because right now, every country in the world is at the whim of the U.S. if the U.S. decides to turn you off of SWIFT.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, Union Pay is a good alternative, but to the other side, when you talk about a digital yuan, we're not talking about, I don't think we're really talking about a cryptocurrency because it's not decentralized. It is something that is completely controlled by one entity, which is which is China. So
yes,
it's
yes.
like
obviously you're right, but it is a digital currency.
Of
right?
course, but that's the difference between Bitcoin and other types of digital currency before that, was that we had digital currency before. It's just you didn't really truly own it. The person managing the system truly owned it. And I know I'm not teaching you anything here because I've heard you say that for years. So.
yes. No, but I think while that's important to me and you, most of the world today, it's just not. It just doesn't matter. They don't appreciate the difference.
It really depends which country you are in. I mean, it's always the same debate. It's like in China, if you're confronted to the fact that you can't get your cash out of the country, you know what the yuan is doing to you, and the control of the Chinese government on your assets means. But
okay, and if you're somebody the U.S. doesn't like, try to move money around SWIFT.
All right. Thank you very much, Pierre. Mike.
Thank you very much, guys, for this very lively event. These digital assets are backed by infrastructures and backed by data centers and computers, etc. I read somewhere that the Bitcoin energy consumption is equal to the ones of Switzerland. Growing this digital asset world, is it going to be good for the planet?
So there's a saying that 98.2% of statistics are invented on the spot, and I think that certainly applies to crypto. I mean, there's a sort of a narrow answer, which is there's a lot of kind of fake statistics around crypto energy consumption. The more kind of useful answer is part of the reason why Ethereum just moved to a new architecture is that it radically reduced the power consumption. So I would think in general one would kind of look at these things as sort of this is kind of in the category of complaints people make about technology at the beginning that get fixed. And I don't think there's any sort of fundamental reason why we should think of cryptocurrencies as like having unsustainable energy consumption or any more than any other digital technology. But I wonder if anyone in the panel disagrees with that.
Well, Nick Carter.
Interesting stat. Sorry, Lou. There's an interesting stat about, I think, if you look at the energy consumption of YouTube, which you were referencing earlier, Lou, which is, I don't know how they actually, I'm sure they made it up. It's in the 98.2 of made up statistics, but it's materially larger than the Bitcoin consumption. And look, we are a miner, and and this is a real statistic. I think 60% of the energy consumption of Bitcoin can be shown to be sustainable in some way, shape, or form. So you can go deeper down, but Lou, over to you.
No, to me, this is not. This is an issue because people think it's an issue. First, you're using the energy. What are you getting for the energy, right? We use massive amounts of energy to create steel so we can build skyscrapers. So do we need skyscrapers? No, but we think that the energy use is worse, than getting the skyscrapers and driving cars. So, the amount of energy it uses relative to the value you're getting, to me, seems to be, we don't talk about energy for some reason, a lot of other industries, cows. But, that said, an ever-increasing percentage, but also is sustainable, right? And so, it'll be an issue, and moving to proof of stake, certainly, I think for Ethereum, was a nice headline, but I find it hard to believe we're still going to be talking about this as an issue in 5 or 10 years, but it's certainly an issue today.
Yeah, it's a bit like complaining of saying the internet doesn't work because it's too slow. Well, yes, but that will get fixed. If it's useful, that will get fixed.
All right.
Maybe to simplify the thing is this is just a discussion about proof of work, and right now the only cryptocurrency that's left on proof of work is Bitcoin, and so it's a discussion between Bitcoin and all the rest of blockchain, and so the question, the rest of blockchain basically is as energy effective or efficient as the rest of the digital space. The question about Bitcoin is why are we burning? Why is it built this way? It's a debate, even in some people in the Bitcoin community. But even if it stayed this way, it's still consuming less than the gold industry. So it's like it's trying to replace gold and become digital gold, and it's still more energy efficient than gold at the moment. But really, it's a debate between Bitcoin and all the rest of crypto.
All right, and that will be the end of this panel session. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much, Lou. And thank you, Ben, for the moderation.
Thank you.